हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू द लाइव सेशन। तो आज हम पढ़ेंगे एनसीईआरटी हिस्ट्री क्लास 11 का सेक्शन 4 जो कि है टूवर्ड्स मॉडर्नाइजेशन डिस्प्लेसिंग इंडिजिनस पीपल पास टू मॉडर्नाइजेशन। तो पहले ये देखते हैं टूवर्ड्स मॉडर्नाइजेशन। In the previous section, you have learned about certain crucial developments in the medieval and early modern world. Feudalism, the European Renaissance, and the encounters between Europeans and the people of the Asia, Africa, and Americas. As you would have realized, some of the phenomena that contributed to the making of our modern world gradually evolved in this period, and especially so from the mid 15th century onwards. Two further developments in world history created a context for what has been called modernization. These were the Industrial Revolution and a series of political revolutions that transformed subjects into citizens, beginning with the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Britain has been the world's first industrial nation. For long, it was believed that British industrialization provided the model for industrialization in other countries. However, historians have begun to question some of the earlier ideas about the Industrial Revolution. Each country drew upon the experiences of other nations without necessarily reproducing any model. In Britain, for instance, coal and cotton textile industries were developed in the first phase of industrialization, while the invention of railways initiated the second stage of that process. In other countries such as Russia, which began to industrialize much later from the late 19th century onwards, the railway and other heavy industries emerged in the initial phase of industrialization itself. Likewise, the role of the state and of banks in industrialization has differed from country to country. The British case no doubt influenced the industrial trajectories of other nations such as the USA and Germany, two significant industrial powers. It also displayed the human and material cost incurred by Britain on its industrialization, the plight of the laboring poor, especially of children, environmental degradation, and the consequent epidemics of cholera and tuberculosis. In theme 7, you will read how industrial pollution and cadmium and mercury poisoning in Japan stirred people into mass movements against indiscriminate industrialization. European powers began to colonize parts of America and Asia and South Africa well before the Industrial Revolution. Theme 6 tells you the story of what European settlers did to native peoples of America and Australia. The bourgeois mentality of the settlers made them buy and sell everything, including land and water. But the natives, who appeared uncivilized to European Americans, asked, "If you do not own the freshness of the air and the sparkle of the water, how can one buy them?" The natives did not feel the need to own land, fish, or animals. They had no desire to commodify them. If things needed to be exchanged, they could simply be gifted. Quite obviously, the natives and the Europeans represented competing notion of civilization. The former did not allow the European deluge to wipe out their cultures, although US and Canadian governments of the mid 20th century desired natives to join the mainstream, and the Australian authorities of the same period attempted to simply ignore their tradition and culture. One might wonder what is meant by mainstream. How does economic and political power influence the making of mainstream cultures? Western capitalism, mercantile, industrial, and financial, and early 20th century Japanese capitalism created colonies in large part of the Third World. Some of these were settler colonies. Others, such as British rule in India, are examples of direct imperial control. The case of 19th and early 20th century China illustrates a third variant of imperialism. Here, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, America, and Japan meddled in Chinese affairs without directly taking over state power. They exploited the country's resources to their own advantage, seriously compromising Chinese sovereignty and reducing the country to the status of a semi colony. Almost everywhere, colonial exploitation was challenged by powerful nationalist movements. Nationalism, however, also aroused without a colonial context, as in West or Japan. All All nationalisms are doctrines of popular sovereignty. Nationalist movements believe that political power should rest with the people, and this is what makes nationalism a modern concept. Civic nationalism, where sovereignty in all people, regardless of language, ethnicity, religion, or gender. It seeks to create a community of rights exercising citizens and defines nationhood in terms of citizenships, not ethnicity or religion. Ethnic and religious nationalisms try to build national solidarities around a given language, religion, or set of traditions, defining the people ethnically, not in terms of common citizenship. In a in a multi-ethnic country, ethnic nationalists might limit the exercise of sovereignty to a chosen people, often assumed to be superior to minority communities. Today, most Western countries define their nationhood in terms of common citizenship and not by common ethnicity. One prominent exception is Germany, where ideas of ethnic nationalism have had a long and troubling career going back to the reaction against the French imperial occupation of German states in 1806. Ideologies of civic nationalism have vied with those of ethnic or religious nationalism the world over, and this has been so in modern India, China, and Japan as well. As with industrialization, so with past to modernization, different societies have evolved their distinctive modernities. The Japanese and Chinese cases, along with the stories of Taiwan and South Korea, are very instructive in this regard. Japan succeeded in remaining free of colonial control and achieved fairly rapid economic and industrial progress throughout the 20th century. The rebuilding of the Japanese economy after a humiliating defeat in the Second World War should not be seen as a mere post war miracle. As theme-7 shows, it resulted from certain gains that had already been accomplished in the 19th and early 20th century. Did you know, for instance, that by 1910, tuition fees for studying at a primary school had more or less ended and enrollment had become universal? Japan's path to modernization, like that of any other country, has had its own tensions. Those between democracy and militarism, ethnic nationalism and civic nation building, and between what many Japanese describe as tradition and westernization. The Chinese resisted colonial exploitation and their own bureaucratic landed allied through a combination of peasant rebellion, reform, and revolution. By the early 1930s, the Chinese Communist Party, which drew its strength from peasant mobilization, had begun confronting the imperial powers as well as the nationalists who represented the country's allied. It had also started implementing its ideas in selected pockets of the country. Its egalitarian ideology, stress on land reforms, and awareness of women's problems helped it overthrow foreign imperialism and the nationalists in 1949. Once in power, it succeeded in reducing inequalities, spreading education, and creating political awareness. Even so, the country's single party framework and state repression contributed to considerable dissatisfaction with the political system after the mid 1960s. But the Chinese Communist Party has been able to retain control over the country largely because in embracing certain market principles. It reinvented itself and has worked hard to transform China into an economic powerhouse. The different ways in which various countries have understood modernity and sought to achieve it, each in the context of its own circumstances and ideas, make a fascinating story. This section introduces you to some aspects of their story. Timeline for 1700 to 2000. This timeline will give you an idea of what was happening in different parts of the world in the last 3 centuries and how people in different countries contributed to the making of our modern world. It will tell you about the slave trade in Africa and the establishment of the regime in South Africa, about social movement in Europe and formation of nation state, about the expansion of imperial powers and the process of colonization, and about democratic and anti-colonial movements that swept through the world in the last century. It will also refer to some of the invention and technological developments that are associated with modernity. As with all timelines, this one focuses on a few dates. There are others that are important. When you see a series of dates in a timeline, do not think that those are the only dates you need to know. Find out why different timelines focuses on different types of dates and what this selection tells you. तो ये है टाइमलाइन जिसमें सब दिखाया गया है. और यहाँ से हमारा शुरू हो रहा है थीम 6. तो अब हम शुरू करेंगे थीम 6, डिस्प्लेसिंग इंडिजिनियस पीपल्स. तो शुरू करते हैं चैप्टर. This chapter recounts some aspects of the histories of the native people of America and Australia. Theme 8 described the history of the Spanish and Portuguese colonization of South America. From the 18th century, more areas of South America, Central America, North America, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand came to be settled by immigrants from Europe. This led to many of the native peoples being pushed out into other areas. The European settlements were called colonies. When the European inhabitants of the colonies became independent of the European mother country, these colonies became states or countries. In the 19th and 20th century, people from Asian countries also migrated to some of these countries. Today, these Europeans and Asians form the majority in these countries, and the number of the native inhabitants are very small. They are hardly seen in the towns, and peoples have forgotten that they once occupied much of the country and that the names of many rivers, towns, etc. are derived from native names. Example: Ohio, Mississippi, and Seattle in the USA, Saskatchewan in the Canada, Wollongong and Parramatta in Australia. Till the middle of the 20th century, American and Australian history textbooks used to describe how Europeans discovered the Americas and Australia. They hardly mention the native peoples except to suggest that they were hostile to Europeans. These peoples were, however, studied by anthropologists in America from the 1840s. Much later, from the 1960s, the native peoples were encouraged to write their own histories or to dictate them. This is called oral history. Today, it is possible to read historical works and fiction written by the native peoples, and visitors to museums in these countries will see galleries of native art and special museums which show the aboriginal way of life. The new National Museum of the American Indian in the USA has been curated by American Indian themselves. European imperialism. The American empires of Spain and Portugal did not expand after the 17th century. From that time, other countries, France, Holland, and England, began to extend their trading activities and to establish colonies. In America, Africa, and Asia, Ireland also was virtually a colony of England, as the landowners there were mostly English settlers. From the 18th century, it became obvious that while it was the prospect of profit which drove people to establish colonies, there were significant variations in the nature of the colony established. In South Asia, trading companies like the East India Company made themselves into political powers, defeated local rulers, and annexed their territories. They retained the older, well developed administrative system and collected taxes from landowners. Later, they built railways to make trade easier, excavated mines, and established big plantations. In Africa, Europeans traded on the coast except in South Africa, and only in the late 19th century did they venture into the interior. After this, some of the European countries reached an agreement to divide up Africa as colonies for themselves. The word settler is used for the Dutch in South Africa, the British in Ireland, New Zealand, and Australia, and the Europeans in America. The official language in these colonies was English except in Canada, where French is also an official language. Names given by Europeans to countries of the New World. America. First used after the publication of the Travels of Amerigo Vespucci. Canada from Canada village in the language of the Huron Iroquois as heard by the explorer Jacques Cartier in 1535. Australia, 16th century name for land in the Great Southern Ocean. Austral is Latin for south. New Zealand, name given by Tasman of Holland, who was the first to sight these islands in 1642. G is Dutch for sea. The Geographical Dictionary lists over 100 place names in the Americas and Australia which begin with new. North America. The continent of North America extends from the Arctic Circle to the Tropic of Cancer, from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean. West of the chain of the Rocky Mountains is the desert of Arizona and Nevada. Still further west, the Sierra Nevada Mountains. To the east, the Great Plains, the Great Lakes, the valleys of the Mississippi and the Ohio, and the Appalachian Mountains. To the south is Mexico. 40% of Canada is covered with forests. Oil, gas, and mineral resources are found in many areas, which explains the many big industries in the USA and Canada. Today, wheat, corn, and fruit are grown extensively, and fishing is a major industry in Canada. Mining industry and extensive agriculture have been developed only in the last 200 years by immigrants from Europe, Africa, and China. But there were people who had been living in North America for thousands of years before the Europeans learned of its existence. The native peoples. Native means a person born in the place he or she lives in. Till the early 20th century, the term was used by Europeans to describe the inhabitants of countries they had colonized. The earliest inhabitants of North America came from Asia over 30,000 years ago on a land bridge across the Bering Straits, and during the last ice age, 10,000 years ago, they moved further south. The oldest artifact found in America, an arrow point, is 11,000 years old. The population started to increase about 5,000 years ago when the climate became more stable. At sunset on the day before America, that is, before the Europeans reached there and gave the continent this name, diversity lay at every hand. People spoke in more than 100 tongues. They lived by every possible combination of hunting, fishing, gathering, gardening, and farming open to them. The quality of soils and the effort required to open and tend them determined some of their choices of how to live. Cultural and social biases determined others. Surpluses of fish or grain or garden plants or meats helped create powerful, tired societies here but not there. Some cultures had endured for millennia. These peoples lived in bands in villages along river valleys. They ate fish and meat and cultivated vegetables and maize. They often went on long journeys in search of meat, chiefly that of bison, the wild buffalo that roamed the grassland. This became easier from the 17th century when the natives started to ride horses, which they bought from Spanish settlers. But they only killed as many animals as they needed for food. They did not attempt extensive agriculture, and since they did not produce a surplus, they did not develop kingdoms and empires as in Central and South America. There were some instances of quarrels between tribes over territory, but by and large, control of land was not an issue. They were content with the food and shelter they got from the land without feeling any need to own it. An important feature of their tradition was that of making formal alliances and friendships and exchanging gifts. Goods were often not by buying them but as gifts. Numerous languages were spoken in North America, though these were not written down. They believed that time moved in cycles, and each tribe had accounts about their origins and their earlier history, which were passed on from one generation to the next. They were skilled craftspeople and wove beautiful textiles. They could read the land, they could understand the climates and different landscapes in the way literate people read written texts. Encounters with Europeans. Different terms are used in English for the native peoples of the New World. Aborigine native people of Australia in Latin Ab is from origin the beginning. Aboriginal adjective often misused as a noun. American Indian or Emirint or Emir Indian native people of North and South America and the Caribbean. First Nations people, the organized native group recognized by the Canadian government. The Indians Act of 1876 used the term bands, but from the 1980s the word nations is used. Indigenous people, people belonging naturally to a place. Native American, the indigenous people of the Americas. This is the term now commonly used. Red Indian, the brown complexion people whose land Columbus mistook for India. Names of native tribes are often given to things unconnected with them. Dakota, an European, Cherokee, a jeep, Pontiac, a car, Mohawk, a haircut. It was indicated on the stone tablets that the Hopis are a native tribe who live near California. Had that the first brothers and sisters that would come back to them would come as turtles across the land. They would be human beings, but they would come as turtles. So when the time came close, the Hopis were at a special village to welcome the turtles that would come across the land, and they got up in the morning and looked out at the sunrise. They looked out across the desert and they saw the Spanish conquistadors coming, covered in armor like turtles across the land. So this was them. So they went out to the Spanish men and they extended their hand, hoping for the handshake, but into the hand the Spanish man dropped a trinket. And so word spread throughout North America that there was going to be a hard time. That maybe some of the brothers and sisters had forgotten the sacredness of all things, and all the human beings were going to suffer for this on the earth. In the 17th century, the European traders who reached the north coast of North America after a difficult 2 month voyage were relieved to find the native peoples friendly and welcoming. Unlike the Spanish in South America, who were overcome by the abundance of gold in the country, these adventurers came to trade in fish and furs, in which they got the willing help of the natives who were expert at hunting. Further south along the Mississippi River, the French found that the natives held regular gatherings to exchange handicrafts unique to a tribe or food items not available in other regions. In exchange for local products, the Europeans gave the natives blankets, iron vessels, which they used sometimes in place of their clay pots, guns, which was a useful supplement for bows and arrows to kill animals, and alcohol. This last item was something the natives had not known earlier, and they became addicted to it, which suited the Europeans because it enabled them to dictate terms of trade. The Europeans acquired from the natives an addiction to tobacco. Mutual perceptions. In the 18th century, Western Europe defined civilized people in terms of literacy and organized religion and urbanism. To them, the natives of America appeared uncivilized. To some, like the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, such people were to be admired as they were untouched by the corruptions of civilization. A popular term was the noble savage. Some lines in a poem by the English poet William Wordsworth indicate another perspective. Neither he nor Rousseau had met a Native American, but Wordsworth described them as living amid wilds or where fancy had small liberty to grace, the affection to exalt them or refine, meaning that people living close to nature had only limited powers of imagination and emotion. It is interesting to note that another writer, Washington Irving, much younger than Wordsworth and who had actually met native people, described them quite differently. The Indians I have had an opportunity of seeing in real life are quite different from those described in poetry. Tecton, they are, it is true when in company with white men whose goodwill they distrust and whose language they do not understand. But the white man is equally taken under like circumstances. When the Indians are among themselves, they are great mimics and entertain themselves excessively at the expense of the whites, who have supposed them impressed with profound respect for their grandeur and dignity. The white men, as I have witnessed, are prone to treat the poor Indians as little better than animals. Thomas Jefferson, third president of the USA and a contemporary of Wordsworth, spoke of the natives in what that would lead to a public outcry today. This unfortunate race, which we have been taking so much pains to civilize, have justified extermination. To the natives, the goods they exchanged with the Europeans were gifts given in friendship. For the Europeans dreaming of becoming rich, the fish and furs were commodities which they would sell for a profit in Europe. The prices of the goods they sold varied from year to year, depending on the supply. The natives could not understand this. They had no sense of the market in the far-away Europe. They were puzzled by the fact that the European traders sometimes gave them a lot of things in exchange for their goods, sometimes very little. They were also saddened by the greed of the Europeans. Many folktales of the native mocked Europeans and described them as greedy and deceitful, but because these were told as imaginary stories, it was only much later that the Europeans understood the references. In their impatience to get furs, they had slaughtered hundreds of beavers, and the natives were very uneasy, fearing that the animals would take revenge on them for their destruction. Following the first Europeans who were traders were those who came to settle in America. From the 17th century, there were groups of Europeans who were being persecuted because they were of a different sect of Christianity. Protestants living in predominantly Catholic countries or Catholics in countries where Protestantism was the official religion. Many of them left Europe and went to America to begin a new life. As long as there was vacant land, this was not a problem, but gradually the Europeans moved further inland near native villages. They used their iron tools to cut down forests to lay out farms. Natives and Europeans saw different things when they looked at forest. Natives identified tracks invisible to the Europeans. Europeans imagined the forest cut down and replaced by cornfields. Jefferson's dream was a country populated by Europeans with small farms. The natives who grew crops for their own needs, not for sale and profit, and thought it was wrong to own the land, could not understand this. In Jefferson's view, this made them uncivilized. The countries that are known as Canada and the United States of America came into existence at the end of the 18th century. At that time, they occupied only a fraction of the land they now cover. Over the next 100 years, they extended their control over more territory to reach their present size. Large areas were acquired by the USA by purchase. They bought land in south from France, the Louisiana Purchase, and from Russia, Alaska, and by war much of southern USA was owned from Mexico. It did not occur to anyone that the consent of natives living in these areas should have been asked. The western frontier of the USA was a shifting one, and as it moved, the natives also were forced to move back. The landscape of America changed drastically in the 19th century. The Europeans treated the land differently from the natives. Some of the migrants from Britain and France were younger sons who would not inherit their father's property and therefore were eager to own land in America. Later, there were waves of immigrants from countries like Germany, Sweden, and Italy who had lost their lands to big farmers and wanted farms they could own. People from Poland were happy to work in the prairie grasslands, which reminded them of the steppes of their homes, and were excited at being able to buy used properties at very low prices. They cleared lands and developed agriculture, introducing crops, rice and cotton, which could not grow in Europe and therefore could be sold there for profit. To protect their huge farms from wild animals, wolves, and mountain lions, these were hunted to extinction. They felt totally secure only with the invention of barbed wires in 1873. The climate of the southern region was too hot for Europeans to work outdoors, and experience of South American colonies had shown that the natives who had been enslaved had died in large numbers. Plantation owners therefore bought slaves in Africa. Protest by anti slavery groups led to a ban on slave trade. But the Africans who were in the USA remained slaves, as did their children. The northern states of the USA, where the economy did not depend on plantations and therefore on slavery, argued for ending slavery, which they condemned as an inhumane practice. In 1861 to 65, there was a war between the states that wanted to retain slavery and those supporting abolition. The latter owned slavery was abolished, though it was only in the 20th century that the African Americans were able to win the battle for civil liberties, and segregation between whites and non whites in schools and public transport was ended. The Canadian government had a problem which was not to be solved for a long time, and which seemed more urgent than the question of the natives. In 1763, Canada had been owned by the British after a war with France. The French settlers repeatedly demanded autonomous political status. It was only in 1867 that this problem was solved by organizing Canada as a confederation of autonomous states. The native people lose their land. In the USA, as settlement expanded, the natives were induced or forced to move. After signing treaties selling their land, the prices paid were very low, and there were instances when the Americans, a term used to mean the European people of the USA, cheated them by taking more land or paying less than promised. Even high officials saw nothing wrong in depriving the native people of the land. This is seen by an episode in Georgia, a state in the USA. Officials had argued that the Cherokee tribe was governed by the state laws but could not enjoy the rights of citizens. This was despite the fact that all the native peoples, the Cherokees, were the ones who had made the most effort to learn English and to understand the American way of life. Even so, they were not allowed the rights of citizens. In 1832, an important judgment was announced by the U.S. Chief Justice John Marshall. He said that the Cherokees were a distinct community occupying its own territory in which the laws of Georgia had no force, and that they had sovereignty in certain matters. US President Andrew Jackson had a reputation for fighting against economic and political privilege. But when it came to the Indians, he was a different person. He refused to honor the Chief Justice's judgment and ordered the US Army to evict the Cherokees from the land and drive them to the great American desert. Of the 15,000 people thus forced to go, over a quarter died along the Trail of Tears. Those who took the land occupied by the tribes justified it by saying the natives did not deserve to occupy land which they did not use to maximum. They went on to criticize them for being lazy since they did not use their craft skills to produce goods for the market, for not being interested in learning English or dressing correctly, which meant like the Europeans. They deserved to die out, they argued. The prairies were cleared for farmland and wild bison killed off. Primitive man will disappear with a primitive animal, wrote a visiting Frenchman. Meanwhile, the natives were pushed westward, given land elsewhere, theirs in perpetuity, but often moved again if any mineral, lead, or gold or oil was found on their lands. Many tribes were forced to share the land originally occupied by one tribe, thus leading to quarrels between them. They were locked up in small areas called reservations, which often was land with which they had no earlier connections. They did not give in without a fight. The US Army crushed a series of rebellions from 1865 to 1890. And in Canada, there were armed revolts by the Métis, people of native European descent, between 1869 and 1885. But after that, they gave up. Anthropology, it is significant that it was at this time from the 1840s from the that the subject of anthropology which had been developed in France was introduced in North America. Out of a curiosity to study the differences between native primitive communities and the civilized communities of Europe, some anthropologists argued that just as there were no primitive people to be found in Europe, the American natives too would die out. In 1854, the President of the USA received a letter from a native leader, Chief Settle. The President had asked the chief to sign a treaty giving a large part of the land they lived on to the American government. The chief replied, "How can you buy or sell the sky, the warmth of the land? The idea is strange to us. If you do not own the freshness of the air and the sparkle of the water, how can one buy them? Every part of the earth is sacred to my people. Every shining pine needle, every sandy shore, every mist in the dark woods, every clearing and every humming insect is holy in the memory and experience of my people. The sap which courses through the trees carries the memories of the red man." So, when the great chief in Washington sends word that he wishes to buy our land, he asks much of us. The great chief sends words that he will reserve us a place so that we can live comfortably. He will be our father and we will be his children. So we will consider your offer to buy our land, but it will not be easy, for this land is sacred to us. The shining water that moves in the streams and rivers is not just water but the blood of our ancestors. If we sell you land, you must remember that it is sacred And you must teach your children that it is sacred and that each ghostly reflections in the clear water of the lakes tells of events and memories in the life of my people. The water's murmur is the voice of my father's father. The gold rush and the growth of industries. There was always the hope that there was gold in North America. In the 1840s, traces of gold were found in the USA in California. This led to the gold rush, when thousands of eager Europeans hurried to America in the hope of making a quick fortune. This led to the building of railway lines across the continent, for which thousands of Chinese workers were recruited. The USS Railway was completed by 1870. That of Canada by 1885. The old nations creep on at a snail's pace, said Andrew Kennedy's, a poor immigrant from Scotland who became one of the first millionaire industrialists in the USA. The Republic thunders so on at the speed of an express. One reason why the Industrial Revolution happened in England when it did was because small peasants were losing their land to big farmers and moving to jobs in factories. In North America, industries developed for very different reasons: to manufacture railway equipment so that rapid transport could link distant places, and to produce machinery which would make large scale farming easier. Industrial towns grew and factories multiplied both in the USA and Canada. In 1860, the USA had been an underdeveloped economy. In 1890, it was the leading industrial power in the world. Large scale agriculture also expanded. Vast areas were cleared and divided up into farms. By 1890, the bison had almost been exterminated, thus ending the life of hunting the natives had followed for centuries. In 1892, the US's continental expansion was complete. The area between the Pacific and Atlantic Ocean was divided up into states. There no longer remained the frontier that had pulled European settlers west for many decades. Within a few years, the USA was setting up its own colonies in Hawaii and the Philippines. It had become an imperial power. Constitutional rights. The democratic spirit, which had been the rallying cry of the settlers in their fight for independence in the 1770s, came to define the identity of the USA against the monarchies and aristocracies of the Old World. Also important to them was that their constitution included the individual's right to property, which the state could not override. But both democratic rights, the right to vote for representatives to Congress and for the president, and the right to property were only for white men. Daniel Paul, a Canadian native, pointed out in 2000 that Thomas Paine, the champion of democracy at the time of the War for American independence and the French Revolution, used the Indians as models of how society might be organized. He used this to argue that the Native Americans, by their example, sowed the seeds for the long drawn out movement towards democracy by the people of Europe. We were not the savages. Karl Marx, the great German philosopher, described the American frontier as the last positive capitalist utopia, the limitless nature and space to which the limitless thirst for profit adapts itself. The winds of change. Not till the 1920s did things begin to improve for the native peoples of the USA and Canada. The Problem of Indian Administration, a survey directed by social scientist Louis Merriam was and published in 1928, only a few years before the USA was swept by a major economic depression that affected all its people, painted a grim picture of the terribly poor health and education facility for natives in reservations. White Americans felt sympathy for the natives who were being discouraged from the full exercise of their cultures and simultaneously denied the benefits of citizenship. This led to a landmark law in the USA, the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which gave natives in reservation the right to buy land and take loans. In 1950s and 1960s, the USA and Canadian government thought of ending all special provisions for the natives in the hope that they would join the mainstream, that is, adopt European culture. But the natives did not want this. In 1954, in the Declaration of Indian Rights prepared by them, a number of native peoples accepted citizenship of the USA, but on condition that their reservation would not be taken away and their tradition would not be interfered with. A similar development occurred in Canada. In 1969, the government announced that they would not recognize Aboriginal rights. The natives, in a well organized opposition move, held a series of demonstrations and debates. The question could not be resolved till 1982, when the Constitution Act accepted the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the natives. Many details remain to be worked out. Today, it is clear that the native peoples of both countries, though reduced so much in numbers from what they had been in the 18th century, have been able to assert their rights to their own cultures and, particularly in Canada, to their sacred lands in a way their ancestors could not have done in the 1880s. Indians under British rule text arbitrarily seen as not equal, rationalization not ready for responsibility of representative government. Natives in America and African slaves in America, not seen as citizens, not equal Australians, rationalization primitive as in no settled agriculture provision for the future towns, denied personal liberty, not equal. Rationalization, slavery is a part of the social system, black people are inferior. Australia. As in the Americas, human habitation in Australia has a long history. The Aborigines, a general name given to a number of different societies, began to arrive on the continent over 40,000 years ago, possibly even earlier. They came from New Guinea, which was connected to Australia by a land bridge. In the natives' tradition, they did not come to Australia but had always been there. The past centuries were called the dream time, something difficult for Europeans to understand, since the distinction between past and present is blurred. In the late 18th century, there were between 350 and 750 native communities in Australia, each with its own language. Even today, 200 of these languages are spoken. There is another large group of indigenous people living in the north, called the Torres Strait Islanders. The term aborigine is not used for these as they are believed to have migrated from elsewhere and belong to a different race. Together, they make up 2.4% of Australia's population in 2005. Australia is sparsely populated, and even now, most of the towns are along the coast where the British first arrived in 1770. Because the central region is arid desert, the story of the interaction between the European settlers, the native peoples, and the land in Australia has many points of similarity to the story of Americas. Though it began nearly 300 years later, initial reports from Captain Cook and his crew about encounters with natives are enthusiastic about their friendliness. There was a sharp reversal of feeling on the part of British when Cook was killed by a native, not in Australia but in Hawaii. As often happened, a single incident of this nature was used by colonizers to justify subsequent acts of violence towards other people. a description of the Sydney area in 1790. Aboriginal production had been dramatically distributed by the British presence. The arrival of 1,000 hungry mouths, followed by hundreds more, put unprecedented pressure on local food resources. So, what would the Daruk people have thought of all this? To them, such large scale destruction of sacred places and strange violent behavior towards the land was inexplicable. The newcomers seemed to knock down trees without any reason, for they were not making canoes, gathering bush honey, or catching animals. Stones were moved and staked together, clay dug up, shaped, and cooked holes were made in the ground. Large, unwieldy structures built. At, at first, they may have equated the clearing with the creation of a sacred ceremonial ground. Perhaps they thought a huge ritual gathering was to be held, dangerous business from which they should steer well clear. There is no doubt the Daruks subsequently avoided the settlement, for the only way to bring them back was an official kidnapping. They did not foresee that in the 19th and 20th centuries, nearly 90% of them would die by exposure to germs, by the loss of their lands and resources, and in battles against the settlers. The experiment of settling Brazil with Portuguese convicts had been abandoned when their violent behavior provoked angry reprisal from the natives. The British had adopted the same practice in the American colonies until they became independent. Then they continued it in Australia. Most of the early settlers were convicts who had been deported from England and, when their jail term ended, were allowed to live as free people in Australia on condition that they did not return to Britain, with no recourse but to make a life for themselves in this land so different from their own. They felt no hesitation about ejecting natives from land they took over for cultivation. The economic development of Australia under European settlement was not so as varied as in America. Vast sheep farms and mining stations were established over a long period and with much labor, followed by vineyards and wheat farming. This came to form the basis of the country's prosperity. When the states were united and it was decided that a new capital would be built for Australia in 1911, one name suggested for it was Wolfwood Gold. Ultimately, it was called Canberra. Canberra, a native word meaning meeting place. Some natives were employed in farms under conditions of work so harsh that it was little different from slavery. Later, Chinese immigrants provided cheap labor as in California, but unease about being dependent on non whites led to the governments in both countries to ban Chinese immigrants. Till 1974, such was the popular fear that dark people from South Asia or Southeast Asia might migrate to Australia in large numbers that there was a government policy to keep non white people out. The wind of change. In 1968, people were electrified by a lecture by the anthropologist W.E.H. Stenner entitled The Great Australian Silence. The silence of historians about the Aborigines from the 1970s, as was happening in North America. There was an eagerness to understand natives not as anthropological curiosities but as communities with distinct cultures, unique ways of understanding nature and climate, with a sense of community which had vast bodies of stories, textiles, and painting and carving skills, which should be understood and recorded and respected. Underlying it all was the urgent question which Henry Reynolds later articulated in a powerful book, Why Weren't We Told? This condemned the practice of writing Australian history as though it had begun with Captain Cook's discovery. Since then, university departments have been instituted to study native cultures. Galleries of native art have been added to art galleries. Museums have been enlarged to incorporate dioramas and imaginatively designed rooms explaining native culture, and natives have begun writing their own life histories. This has been a wonderful effort. It has also occurred at a critical time because if native cultures had remained ignored by this time, much of such cultures would have been forgotten. From 1974, multiculturalism has been official policy in Australia, which gave equal respect to native cultures and to different cultures of the immigrants from Europe and Asia. Katie, my sister, with the torn heart, I don't know how to thank you for your Dreamtime stories of joy and grief written on paper bark. You were one of the dark children I was not allowed to play with. Riverbank campers, the wrong color, I could not turn you white. So it was late I met you, late I began to know. They hadn't told me the land I loved was taken out of your hands. Judith Wright, an Australian writer, was a champion of the rights of the Australian Aborigines. She wrote many moving poems about the laws created by keeping the white people and the natives apart. From the 1970s, as the term human rights began to be heard at meetings of the UNO and other international agencies, the Australian public realized with dismay that, in contrast to the USA, Canada, and New Zealand, Australia had no treaties with the natives formalizing the takeover of land by Europeans. The government has always termed the land of Australia terra nullius, that is, belonging to nobody. There was also a long and agonizing history of children of mixed blood, native European, being forcibly captured and separated from their native relatives. Agitation around this question led to inquiries and to two important decisions. One, to recognize that the natives had strong historic bonds with the land which was sacred to them and which should be respected. Two, that while past acts could not be undone, there should be a public apology for the injustice done to the children in an attempt to keep white and colored people apart. तो इसी के साथ हमारा ये चैप्टर ख़त्म होता है। यह है इस चैप्टर का एक्सरसाइज। और अगर आपको डेली लाइव क्लास ज्वाइन करना है तो चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कर दीजिए और नोटिफिकेशन आइकन पर क्लिक कर दीजिए, और वीडियो अच्छा लगे तो लाइक कर दीजिए। तो हमारा आज का चैप्टर यहीं तक था। थैंक यू, थैंक्स फॉर ज्वाइनिंग।